you notice each week we have a video from Prayercast, and this morning when we were meeting before the service here, John mentioned, each one of these they end up a little bit sad and things. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's not the point of Prayercast. It's to pray for these different countries. So hopefully today Australia wasn't quite so sad as some of the others might have been. I can understand when you get Syria or Iraq and some of the devastation that's happened there, but we don't want them just to be sad, right? Well, last week I shared how I was doing a kettlebell challenge where I was swinging a kettlebell 300 times a day for 30 days. And this week I'm sharing how I injured my back doing a kettlebell challenge, swinging a kettlebell 300 times each day for 5 days is all it ended up to be. I explained to the students on Friday at the youth group that I'm dealing with old people problems, like high cholesterol. That was a few weeks ago that I talked about that, right? And now the back injury. How could someone in the prime of his youth, like I am, well, maybe I'm not quite so prime as I think I am. When I discovered last week that these challenges, whether they're kettlebell challenges or sit-up challenges or push-up challenges or whatever, they might look a little bit different at 52 years old than maybe my 21-year-old daughter who just jumped right in and joined us in this. 6 months ago, I tried to launch into kettlebells just the same and caused a hernia. Again, old people problems, right? Mind you, I did break my back a few years ago when I was 47 years old, so I have an understandable excuse. But some of you might say, well, what were you doing climbing trees with your children at 47 years old? Again, old people problems. And I feel young, and maybe that's just the problem, isn't it? That I feel young and I keep doing things that my body is saying, you're not young, okay? Let's just get this right. So last week, my body told me I needed rest. My body forcefully hit the pause button. And to all of us, we need to know rest in addition to activity. To know all of God, you need to know the rest of God. And so today we're looking at this text, Hebrews chapter 4, which talks about Jesus being better than Joshua. And how is he better? Well, it's particularly in this regard for rest. So we'll be talking about rest, particularly the pause that the Lord expects of us. So let's go ahead and read our text here this morning. I'll be reading from the English Standard Version, which is the same as the Bibles in front of you, and it'll also be the same as the Bibles you'll see, or the passages you'll see on the screen there. To find Hebrews, simply look in the table of contents at the front of the Bible and find Hebrews in that list. Go to that page. That's the easiest thing. And then the big numbers are chapter numbers. And so even if this is a very early thing, new thing for you to be looking through the Bible, I do hope that you'll have that in front of you. So let's go ahead and read here together about this promise of rest. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear, lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us, just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest, as he has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has somewhere spoken of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again, in this passage, he said, they shall not enter my rest. Since, therefore, it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, again, he appoints a certain day, today, saying through David, so long afterward, in the words already quoted, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. There it is, excuse me. Need my water. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, just as God did from his. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. May the Lord strengthen his word and give us even more benefit from it here this morning. So this morning we're looking at rest, and I mentioned last week that this is the second half of the second warning in the book of Hebrews. The first half that we talked about last week was primarily about these people who were disobedient to God in the wilderness, and they tested his patience constantly. He swore that they would not enter into his rest. Today, he turns our attention to the people who would enter his rest, namely those who believe and are faithful. That's what the promise is all about. It's about the good stuff for obedience, not just about the bad stuff for disobedience. So that being said, the author wants us to know that we don't just get a free ride into the good stuff without taking seriously the life changes that are necessary as a response to the good stuff. This is communicated in the first word of the passage, which launches out, "Let us fear, therefore." The last chapter started, "Therefore, consider Jesus." This chapter starts, "Therefore, fear." Both of these are deep considerations. If we think deeply enough about Jesus, we will be thinking deeply enough to avoid failure in following Jesus. We'll be thinking about how we will connect ourselves and follow Jesus in a faithful way. If we truly get a glimpse of his greatness, it will change our behavior forever. We will fear the prospect of falling short of following him because of how great he is. You might ask me, "Well, Pastor Dave, if I'm a child of God, if I'm a brother or a sister, if I'm part of the household of God, as you've talked about these past few weeks, what do I have to fear?" And the answer from Hebrews is that what you have to fear is that you might not live up to the extraordinary greatness that you've tasted, that you've glimpsed. You see just a glimpse of Jesus' glory, and you know there is so much more glory that you don't see. There is so much more that you know exists that you can't even fathom, that you don't want to offend that glory in any way whatsoever. To the extent that you know the glory of Jesus, you will hate the sin that offends Jesus. You will fear even the possibility of falling into his displeasure. You will hate sin like he hates sin. You will love the things that he loves, because of that slightest alignment, that slightest glimmer that you have of the greatness of his glory. That's what knowing God is all about. And to know all of God, you need to know the rest of God. Well, when we're talking about a day of rest, and I want to use this as an example here, as you know, I love carpentry and that sort of things, and these are called dovetail joints. And you see how they're made in the upper right-hand corner. They're hand chiseled, these custom joints. And they're really strong because they're hand chiseled to the exact shape that they need to be. You can see that beautiful joinery right there, right? I mean, don't you agree? Paul, I know you agree. This is beautiful joinery, isn't it? It takes someone who plays around with these things to really admire it. Well, the interlocking joints that we see are the same thing that we see in chapter 3 into chapter 4. What Apollos is saying in chapter 4 is a dovetail mate to what he just said last week in chapter 3. We read the Lord's words about these disobedient people when he said, they always go astray in their heart. They have not known my ways. I noted how this translated into, they have never, not once known my ways. That's really the point of what this is saying. That is the opposite of how he continues here today in chapter 4, verse 3, where he says, when he talks about those who believed are entering into his rest. This is a mirror construction to what he wrote in chapter 3 about those who have never, no, not once, believed. Now you, on the other hand, have believed. And so it's a completely different character that he's bringing about. The author is making a point with his description of this belief and rest. And I don't want you to miss out on that. That's his point. For those who have never believed, they will never enter his rest. For those who have believed, they are entering into his rest. Make sure you are part of that second group. Now, I didn't make a mistake in saying that they are entering his rest. This rest is not just something in the distant future that these people might hope for in the end times. It's not like when we hope that we will get to heaven. That's not what it's talking about. This is rest that these people enjoy right now. It's not just all about the future. Have they fully experienced it? No. Do we fully understand what it is to be with God? No. We don't understand that yet. But yes, we have begun to understand that. And no, we don't understand all of it, because there will be much more that we will enjoy 72 billion years from now that we don't experience now. But are we experiencing it now? Yes, most certainly we are. Our joy has already started. These people, are already entering that rest. From the point of conversion, something is new. I mean, we think back to the point of our conversion, how we turn our attention to the Lord, how the Lord opens our eyes, and no longer are we blinded by the sin that we walk in, that we see before us God. He opens our eyes, and that has an effect for right now and for the future. It has the effect that we want to please God, when previously we didn't care about God. Suddenly, we hate the things that displease God, and that's the character of genuine faith. Therefore, consider Jesus. Therefore, fear. That's how this starts out. What the author does now is turn our attention back on this dial of time, all the way to the earliest times, to creation itself. He does this in verse 3 by mentioning that the Lord's works have been finished since the foundation of the world. So he draws our attention all the way back to the very beginning. And he continues it when he talks about the seventh day, the Sabbath day, and the rest, and he relates that to us. Finally, he circles back around to Moses and to Joshua and the rest that they would bring when they went into the promised land. So there are three different things that he addresses here. So if you're keeping an outline of this sermon, these points would look something like this. This is the second point, but there's A, and there's B, and there's C, and there's D. And by the way, if you're interested in outlines and taking notes in sermons, what I did this past week was I purchased they're a copy of Hebrews. So it has the whole book of Hebrews in it, but then it leaves one page that's open for notes and things like this so that you can, as you go into Sermon HD, high def, that you're going through all of these things, that you can keep track of some of those notes. Some of those things that you learn. So 10 of those will be coming next week. And if you're interested, those are available and you can pick one up next week. They're arriving today. Thank you, Amazon. I'm glad for the quick delivery that we have. But nonetheless, those are on the way. This is what that sort of outline would look like. The knowing, believing parallel that we've already talked about. The foundation of the world, the Sabbath day of rest. Moses and Joshua, and the incomplete rest. What the author does now, it's turn our attention back in this dial of time all the way to the beginning to the foundation of the world. So as I mentioned, we've already talked about the knowing and believing parallel from chapter 3 to chapter 4 in the first part of this warning into the second part of this warning. And now we look at the foundation of the world, which is, of course, God's creative work. That's what he did and only he could do. Of all the things that are worshiped, the so-called gods in the world, there's only one that created all things. And that is the God that we serve. And so God himself uses that as a marker of who he is, as an identifier of who he is, that he himself created the world and did something that no one else could do. Well, when we saw in Hebrews chapter 1, verses 2 and 3, when we first looked at this, here's what we saw. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, and through whom he created the world. So right there at the beginning of Hebrews, it says the same thing. It draws our attention back to the creation of the world. But we have to say, is that all that God did? He just set us spinning kind of in a deistic way where he put all the motion of the world in place and then just let it go? No, because of verse 2. He is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. And he upholds the universe by the word of his power. And that takes some work as well. So when we're talking about work here, it's not just a cessation of all activity, because obviously God is still working. He is still active in upholding the universe by his power. Yes, his work of creation has stopped, but on the one hand, he's continuing to work in the sense that he is upholding and sustaining all things by his powerful word. God did stop creating. Yes, that's the point of to see the seventh day. And so that's what we look at here is that point of to see. Did God stop creating things and bring about a Sabbath rest? Yes, he did. Now, what does that mean for us? Is it something that still applies today? Well, yes, and this is very important to understand. It did not stop after 24 hours. God's Sabbath, his rest, did not stop after 24 hours. Rather, it continues till today. And the importance of this is that this is what applies to us. Our rest, when this author of Hebrews makes this connection, he wants you to see that this rest is something that starts in your life and it will never end. That's an important thing for us to understand. And he relates this back to the same way that God took rest from his creative works, and he's no longer creating things anew from the very beginning. We'll build on this momentarily, but the key point is that this writer wants you to see that not every day is made equal. Not every day is 24 hours. Not even in the creation itself was every day 24 hours. To force the use of day to mean a 24-hour day would put an end to God's rest. And that's not what we want to do, because, again, that would be 24 hours of rest, and it just doesn't make sense for our salvation to last for 24 hours. It's much longer. There's something else to understand about the character of this seventh day. This pause, and that's literally the word that's used, is pause for rest, does not mean absolute cessation of activity. After all, God is upholding the universe, and that takes quite a bit of energy, quite a bit of work that goes into that. He continues to do miracles, for example, which are outside of the normal laws of the natural processes of events. He continues to hear prayers and to intervene in response to those prayers in the events of humankind. So God has not ceased all activity. Does that make sense? He has not ceased, he has ceased his work of creation, but he has not ceased all the things that God does. So the character of the seventh day is different, both in time as well as in the work that is done. Well, what does this mean for us? Should we take a regular Sabbath? Should we do as God commanded and remember the Sabbath to keep it holy? Yes. My body says yes. I mean, remember, I need that rest because I'm getting old, right? I need that rest. We need rest. Well, which day should we do that? If you said Sunday, you fell into a trick question. And that's the whole point of this character change of time and the change even on the Sabbath. The Sabbath, that is the seventh day, has always been and continues to be Saturday. We as believers began to observe Sunday as our day of rest, the momentous day of celebration for us as Christians, and rest on that day because it is the Lord's day when he rose from the dead. As modern Christians, we have conflated our day of rest and the Lord's day into the Christian celebration on Sunday. But Sunday is not technically the Sabbath day. Is that a problem? Of course not. That's why Paul makes such an effort in his writings to say that for some people they honor the day or the new moons or the festivals, and other people do not. But they do it by faith. We are free as Christians not to be bound by the specific day. That's the point that Paul makes. Does that mean that we should throw out the idea of Sabbath and not rest? Well, no. Again, my body says that. All of us know that we need rest. We can honor the Lord with a day of rest that we keep in remembrance of his completed work of creation, whether that day is on Saturday or on Sunday or on Tuesday or whenever that might be. For those of you who are game show enthusiasts, here's a quick lightning round of Q&A about the Sabbath that might interest you. Is the Sabbath for Christians? Well, yes, the command to observe the Sabbath came at the foundation of the world, not just with the Mosaic law that has been fulfilled by Jesus. So, yes, we are supposed to keep a day of rest. Here's another one. Is the Sabbath for today? Does that mean that it is for us even today, not just Christians of the past? Yes, the Sabbath is good as a day of rest even today. Is the Sabbath just Saturday? Well, we kind of just answered that one, didn't we? We said no, it's not exclusively Saturday. Technically, it is because that's the seventh day, but the Sabbath rest can happen any day of the week. Does everyone practice the Sabbath on the same day? No, throughout all the time that the Sabbath has been around, the priests, for example, have been ministering and doing their normal work on that day. I, as a pastor, do my normal work on a day that is normally rest for you. So not everyone recognizes the Sabbath on the same day. Does the Sabbath mean doing no work whatsoever, like the Pharisees? No, the rest associated with the Sabbath does not mean absolute cessation of activity. It doesn't mean that you don't do any work, but rather you don't do your normal work. You take a break from that work. And for you, what might be rest is walking in the park. And you don't have to count your steps like the Pharisees literally did to make sure that they didn't overwork themselves and count too many steps on those days. Has the Sabbath changed days? Yes, the typical day of rest changed from Saturday to Sunday. And by the way, this is one of the big proofs that Jesus rose from the dead. Why would the day change for these faithful Jewish people, the disciples? Why would the day change unless there was something momentous about that day, such as the resurrection, the Lord's day? So the Sabbath, or the day of rest changing to Sunday, is proof of Jesus' resurrection. Is the Sabbath a 24-hour day? No, the Sabbath of God's rest was always an indefinite time where his creative work stopped, and it continues in that state of it being stopped. When Hebrews 4:3 mentions Sabbath rest, is it talking about a day on the calendar? No, and this is an interesting one. The word Sabbath rest does not refer to the Sabbath of the calendar. The last one will probably take a little bit of explanation, so let me come back to that in a minute. Right now, let's look at the character of this rest that we're talking about. What is this rest all about? As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the character of the seventh day is different both in time as well as in the work that is being done. Additionally, the character of the rest for the Hebrews was different from merely entering the promised land in the days of Moses and Joshua. That is a time when certainly the Hebrew people had rest. They got rest because they entered the promised land. And that was a restful thing. They were able to work and invest that in that land in a way that it wasn't the laborious work that they were doing as slaves in Egypt. But undoubtedly, that rest was significant. I mean, we know that's the case because it marks a defining day in the life of the Jewish nation. By the way, if you're interested in the specific year that happened, in 446 is when the exodus of Egypt, or from Egypt, took place. So 40 years later, 40 years in the wilderness, that would put things at 1406. Was the day of entering into the land. So 1446 is when the Exodus happened, 1406, and of course this is according to the eminent Egyptologist Dr. Charles Ailing, who happened to be my professor, and he was my professor for history of Israel, for history of the Christian church, for biblical archaeology. In fact, Dr. Ailing was also my professor for hieroglyphics class, and he shared with me that our hieroglyphics class was historical. And I was, historical in what way? Indeed, our class was the largest class in the world at the time. And so all 7 of us reveled in that meaningless trivia. So if the Exodus was 1446, the entrance into the promised land was 1406. As momentous as this rest was for the Hebrew people, it is striking that this rest was insufficient. The Hebrews were left singing U2's song, I still haven't found what I'm looking for. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. In the same way that we saw last week that Apollos could talk about Jesus being better than Moses without disparaging Moses, now he talks about Jesus being better than Joshua without disparaging Joshua. That rest was incredibly significant back then, for no less of a reason than it was a springboard into understanding what rest would be for us in salvation. But it was not enough. It was not enough. There was still an incompleteness about that rest. It wasn't eternal rest. To know all of God, you need to know the rest of God. Now we finally get to see what is so significant about this sort of rest and why Apollos would go through so much effort to define this rest for us, from both the perspective of God's Sabbath at creation and the rest that Joshua led the people into in 1406 BC. And we read this: "So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from his." And this verse defines for us what that rest looks like. God rested from his work of creation, and he continues to rest from his work of creation. He's no longer writing the laws of physics to create new universes or multiverses. He rests. In similar manner, there is rest for you. You at one time struggled in your works to either fight against God or to prove yourself to God, and now you can rest because of the completed work of Jesus. He's done that work, and that work can't be added to. It's over. It's finished. The work of salvation is done in Jesus. We can't add to that, and so we rest. Does that mean that we stop all activity? We stop doing good things? Absolutely not. The same way that God continues to intervene in the lives of people even today. The same way that he upholds and sustains the universe by his powerful word. And we also continue to serve him, continue to love him, continue to care for one another, continue to encourage each other to join in to this salvation. God created the universe one time. His rest from that creative work is permanent. Your fight against God was at one time. Your rest from that fight and struggle is permanent. Look at that, at the way that even Scripture describes your salvation. It says this: "But God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." This is from Hebrews chapter 5, verses 8 through 10. "Since therefore we have now been justified by his blood, much more shall we be saved by him from the wrath of God." Now this next verse just wraps it all up together. "For if while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more now that we are reconciled, shall we be saved by his life." Do you see the status change? As enemies, those people that are working against God or trying to prove themselves to God, trying all of these different things, whether it's everything from sacrificing a chicken to offering wine libations and all of the different things that people have done through the years to prove themselves to God, we can set that aside because of the completed work of Jesus. And now we rest from that work forever. We rest in Jesus. There is a rest that is waiting for you that is deeper and more permanent than you could ever imagine. You can rest in God. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. Your striving is no longer with God. Your striving is no longer to prove yourself to God, but rather to ensure that you are in this state of being, that I'm going to do all I can not to offend God. I'm going to love the things that God loves. I'm going to hate the things that God hates because I love Jesus. Because I've got this one little glimpse of who Jesus is. I want to know all of God. To know all of God, you need to know the rest of God. So what are you going to do about this? How are you going to rest? Yes, we can do this in a memorial way. We can remember every week that we need to rest, just as God rested from his creative work. And so are you going to take a Sabbath, a true Sabbath where you rest from your normal work this week? Maybe that's the thing for you. Is there someone that you're going to tell about this? Someone else maybe that's dealing with anxiety and fretting over their work and struggle, and they need to hear about the rest of God. Let's pray. Jesus, help us to rest in you. Help us not to feel that we need to prove ourselves to you anymore, but to get so much of an understanding of who you are and the work that you did that we can rest. We don't need to struggle. We don't need to strive with you anymore. But rather our striving could be making sure that we are in line with Jesus. Give us a sense of your will. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen.